Hey everybody, Michael Album here. Welcome to another episode of the Remote Real Estate Investor. Today I've got with me a very special guest, Clint Coons with Anderson Business Advisors. And Clint's going to be talking to us today about all things asset protection and what we need to know about them as investors. So let's get into it. Clint Coons, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me today. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Mike, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, for all of our listeners, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the world of asset protection.
Well, okay, so I'm an attorney. That goes right. How did I fall into asset protection? Well, I think a lot of it stemmed from the fact when I was growing up, my father was an avid real estate investor, and I think he wanted two kids. He got two sons because he needed indentured servants for 27 years, and so I grew up working on all my dad's real estate for free. He always told me, "Hey, it's going to be yours one day, so you better do a damn good job, or I'm sending you to college and I'm paying for it, so this is your payment." But what was interesting to me is that my grandfather, my dad's dad, he's an attorney, and he never once told my dad, "You should do this, protect your assets, reduce your taxes." And so the few times that my father was involved in a lawsuit, it was more about let's just write a check to make this thing go away. And when I was in law school, I started thinking about this. Hey, there's got to be a better way to do it rather than put yourself out there and have all your assets exposed, because there'd be some times when he would be legitimately concerned about a situation that came up, maybe at an apartment building that he thought, there might be a big lawsuit coming down the road and hit him.
Mm-hmm.
So that got me really started with my partner when we started our firm, Anderson Business Advisors. I never thought I'd be where I'm at today with close to 400 employees and in multiple states. But when we started out, we saw that there was a real need for this, and that people just weren't getting the right type of advice, I guess, when it came to protecting their assets. And so that's what I started doing.
Oh, that's awesome. And you so graciously are going to be offering everyone, all of our listeners, a consult with a link in the show notes. So definitely check that out if you are interested in scheduling a time with Clint or his staff in the show notes section of the podcast. So curious to know, Clint, give us a high level of what asset protection is. What does that entail? Because I think it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, and real estate investors love to sound fancy schmancy. So we love throwing terms around, but give us a breakdown of what does it actually mean?
So here's the thing. I'm going to answer your question, but it's going to be a little different here. Right now I have a portfolio that's over 250 properties spread out across the United. Well, not all. I don't have as many states as I used to, but it's in multiple asset classes, predominantly single-family homes. But I have multifamily, commercial. I also have warehouse and mobile homes. And when I started investing, I went about the approach of you set up an entity, an LLC or a corporation. That's what you're going to do to buy property, and you're going to protect it. And I thought that was the way that it should be done. And over the years, I started to recognize the fact that when it comes to asset protection planning, you just can't look at that by itself. And that's the mistake that I made when I first started practicing. My partner and I, Toby, we came out of the gate in our firm. We were doing really well within the first couple of years, and we could make $500,000. And because our firm works both on the tax and asset protection side, we have CPAs, tax preparers, bookkeepers, and stuff. We would work to reduce our taxes down to zero. And so I can make $500,000 and pay zero in federal income tax. And I thought, man, I'm the smartest guy out there. And
I've made it.
Yeah. Yeah, I have made. You want to be like me? All right, let me just show you some of the things that we could do for you. And all of a sudden, at about 2004 or 5, I realized that all that stuff I was doing on the tax side really wasn't helping me out on the investing side, because I wanted to be a real estate investor, just like my father. I wanted to go out there and buy properties. And I started struggling because, when you go to an underwriter, what do they ask for? Oh, copies of your tax returns. So I turn over my tax returns and they look at them and they say, hell, you make no money. It's like, no, really, I do. Yeah. It just doesn't show up there. And,
right.
Yeah. So you're a drug dealer, right? You're running coke to Miami. Not the best scenario to be in. And so when it came to the asset protection side, I started realizing, all right, so you got the tax side, got this asset protection side. So you can put stuff in entities and you can overstructure yourself. I started realizing too on some of the investments when I was trying to apply for an SBA loan, they would look at some of my structuring and they go, what the hell are you doing? I don't see your name associated with this, and I'm trying to get a loan closed, and I can't get it closed because of some of the planning that I had done, which sounded really great at the time.
Hmm.
And so for me, it was a matter of finally coming to this realization that for any investor, you have to look at three things. You look at asset protection, you look at tax planning, and you look at business planning, and you understand that the entities and the tax planning that you do should further your investing. And investing to me is a business. And many of the things that we tell our clients run contrary to what a CPA is going to say, or possibly what an attorney is going to tell them, because they themselves only look at that one leg, and
Yeah.
they don't understand the wider picture of what it takes to get a deal done. Unless you have tons and gobs of cash floating around where you're not going to use leverage, you have to be sensitive to that. And even when I was flipping properties in the Vegas market for a couple of years, my partner and we'd set up an S corporation to flip them. We had separate LLC set up to minimize the risk, and everything was running great. Then we decided to wind this thing down, as more California investors started coming in and screwing up our returns on these REO deals that we're picking up. Yeah,
We have a tendency to do that kind of across the board, just as a full disclaimer.
I know. We would look at something and think, "Oh man, that's a 16% return." I'm like, I'm not touching anything unless it's 28 to 30, because you get a taste for that, and you don't want to deal with anything else after that point.
Right.
And so I started winding that business down. And because of the way I'd set it up through an S corp, I thought I'd already solved my problems. I went away from deferring all my taxes and changing. I started showing more income, and then I set up this flipping business. And then that flipping business starts to become an anchor around me, because every time I turn over my tax returns, my 1040s, they'd say, "What's going on with this business over here? It looks like it's about out of business." I was like, "I'm just winding it down." Well, how do we know you're just not very successful and you have outstanding obligations and all this stuff that the bankers or underwriters like to throw at the brokers that throw back on you? And it's been a learning experience, to say the least. And so to your question, when you talk about asset protection high level, you need to think of it at that, what I described, think of it as a three-legged stool, that the entities can help you do more. And that's what they should do. You should set up structures that are going to protect you, but at the same time allow you to achieve your goals. You don't want to create a structure that's going to handcuff you and it's going to make it hard for you to get to where you want to be, because you have to deal with title companies. You're going to have to deal with underwriters at the end of the day, and local attorneys or CPAs. And so you have to be able to explain it. And if you can't explain it, you don't understand it, it's really not going to be beneficial for you. And so I always approach it in that manner. Look at what you're doing, and then design the plan around the investing, rather than stick the investor into one common plan, which so many people end up doing when they're working with people who aren't real estate investors themselves.
Yep. I think that makes so much sense. And I love that you have kind of all three components at your company, because I think so often too many of us have a great CPA that we've worked with and then become investors and say, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. Talk to their CPA. TPA tells them something, they go do it. And then they go talk to their attorney, and the attorney's like, yeah, I shouldn't have done that. You're like, oh, crap. Well, the CPA told me. And then the attorney tells you one thing, you go do it. And the CPA goes, oh, I wish you hadn't done that. It's like, come on, can't we all talk under the same roof?
Correct.
So I think that makes
sense. And I would probably step in and tell them a completely different strategy.
Yeah. There you go. So talk to us a little bit about some of the different vehicles that are involved with, we'll call it a quote unquote asset protection, a typical asset protection scheme. A lot of our listeners have a couple single family homes and they're looking to protect themselves. What are some of the different options or vehicles that they have likely heard about that they might want to consider utilizing?
Typically what we're going to look at, of course, is a limited liability company. The LLC for single family investors, if that's what you're doing, the buy and hold type, I like to use limited liability companies in about 90% of the time, because that structure allows you to control how the income is going to hit your tax return, which I think is oftentimes overlooked by people, professionals who are not real estate investors. And I'll come back and circle back to explain that in a minute. So the LLC is a hybrid entity. It gives you asset protection if something happens inside of the box. I always say it's going to stay inside of the box. Mm-hmm. And it also protects your assets from what you may do. Say you sign a personal guarantee on something and then you default and they sue you. Typically, the LLC should protect the assets from your creditors. And so when we're working with investors, we want to make sure that they're utilizing that structure in the right context, and where you're investing as well. because it could change. If you're investing in Florida, I'm probably going to use a land trust in Florida because most people have a mortgage on their property. If they want to protect it and they transfer it into an LLC, well, then you have the doc stamps, which is going to hit you for $1,000 to $3,000 possibly on that transfer. But if you use a land trust, yeah, you don't have to pay any tax, and you get the same asset protection as the LLC if something were to go wrong. Whereas if you're in California, I'm probably going to use a statutory trust out there because in that context, you're going to save $800 a year in a franchise tax. Whereas the LLC in California, they're going to want $800 for each LLC you set up. And there's other nuances per year. That's
for all those
exactly right.
California listeners.
Yeah, maybe in Texas it's a series LLC, or Tennessee might be the same thing. And so what I tend to do is we want to look at where you're investing, number one. And then we'll decide whether or not it's going to be a limited liability company or a trust for single family investments. But the mistake that I see that people make, and I used to make this mistake when I would teach, when I first started teaching asset protection workshops for real estate investors, is that I would tell people, hey, if you got 4 properties, look at the equity value, and if it's under $250,000 to $300,000, put all 4 properties into one limited liability company. And the reason I would tell people that is, I looked at asset protection from an equity standpoint. I got 4 properties. What's the most I stand to lose? That if something goes wrong with one of those properties, there's toxic mold, the smoke detector's not working, and the place burns down because the meth dealer that you're renting to disabled them, and then their family turns around and sues you. These are all stories that have happened to our clients, by the way.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I know.
I thought you were grabbing from thin air.
No, hell no. There's multi-million-dollar lawsuit for wrongful death. And I'm like, he must have been the most successful meth dealer in that county, to say his life was worth that much. But
oh my God.
So you approach it with that mindset that it's all about the equity. And when people think about setting up LLCs, they're trying to save. They think, well, I don't want to spend the money, and they don't see it as an investment. They see it as a cost. Right. And that's really a preservation mindset, not a growth mindset when you go that way. But then it dawned on me when my investing took off and I started buying more, and I started to realize, as a single family investor, it's not about the equity. I'm not buying these properties. I do a lot of investing in Winston-Salem, and that's not an equity play. That is just purely income. And that's why I buy residential real estate is to generate that monthly cash flow, that mailbox money that comes in. So I started realizing, wait a minute, I'm buying for cash flow. And let's say I had 4 properties in one LLC, and one lawsuit takes out all 4 properties. Yeah, I lose $200,000 equity, but that doesn't hurt as bad as losing the $24,000 in income I was bringing in every year, because that's what my wife had quit her job and now she's working full time in real estate, or maybe we're sending our kids to college now and that's $16,000 or $24,000 and we no longer have it. That's life altering for a lot of people, right, to lose that money that you would come to account on. And I started thinking, wait a minute, I'm doing this wrong. I'm doing people a disservice. And so then I started telling them, hey, when it comes to asset protection, put 1 property per LLC. That's and that's not uniform. Okay. Now at my level, I typically group 10 properties per LLC. And people say, well, you're a hypocrite. You just told me to put 1. You're just trying to charge me more make more money off me. Yeah, that's exactly it. That's all. I'm an attorney, right? What stands between lawyer and liar? Pronunciation. So why is that? It's because when you hit my level of investing, you have 200 properties and you have 20 limited liability companies with 10 properties in each. And each of those LLCs, let's say, is throwing off 50 grand a year. I can lose a 10-pack of properties in a lawsuit, and that $50,000, yeah, it sucks to lose $50K, but I've got 19 others giving me $50,000 a year. Whereas if that was all you had and you just lost that $50,000 in income, that's life altering. For me, it's not changing the wine I'm ordering at night. It's not changing where I'm vacationing. It's not changing anything about my lifestyle. And so I often tell people, when you get up to about 20 properties, then look at starting to group them, because I would never put myself in a situation where I have 250 limited liability companies set up to protect my assets.
Right.
But when you're starting out, that's when you really need the protection, because that's when you're more apt to make mistakes as well.
Yeah. So I come from the insurance world, for better or for worse. I was raised in that world and used to work in commercial property insurance. So I'm curious to get your thoughts around people, because there's kind of the two camps. There's the pro LLC camp and then there's the no LLC camp. The no LLC camp says, especially for the California investors, for $800, you can go buy a lot of umbrella insurance, a lot of excess coverage. What are your thoughts around that, for especially for folks that are just starting out?
Well, I mean, you need the insurance no matter what you do, and so you always have to get a policy. The way I look at it when it comes to insurance planning is, do you trust your carrier is going to actually step in when you really need them and going to pick up that claim, or is that claim even covered? Most people never read their policy, so they don't even have a clue as to what's excluded.
Right. And that's a very long list, by the way.
It is, and it keeps getting longer. My partner here at Anderson, he used to be on the insurance side. He represented insurance companies, and he has a great little story where he talks about they'd always, have these conventions about how they're excluding more and even charging more for less coverage.
For less coverage, yeah.
Yeah. So what I tell people is this: the way I go about my planning for our clients is that I want to create a situation where, number one, people don't even know what you own, because the way we structure the LLCs on the single family side, if somebody run an asset search, you're not going to be associated back to these properties. It's really difficult for them to find that you're the owner, because you can set up LLCs in a way in which your name's not tied to it on the public database. So, on Secretary of State's website. And so the whole reasoning behind this strategy is to get the plaintiffs, counsel, to take your policy limits. So listen, that's my whole goal. I say, if you're the likelihood of being sued though is pretty small. I've never been sued on my real estate. I've come close, but I've never been involved in a lawsuit. But if it did happen, I'd want it to be where they say, all right, we can't get after anything, or better yet, they don't even know what you have, and they'll take your policy limits and go away. In fact, one of my clients in California, you brought up California, they have a nightclub. And two guys were injured when they walked out of the nightclub. They got hit by a car by somebody who was in the parking lot. And so these three attorneys representing these two individuals were suing for 15, 20 million bucks. And my client that had the nightclub, which is probably the most responsible party for over-serving someone, was able to walk away with policy limits. That was it. And why was that? Because all of his assets that are close to 15 to 20 million dollars were completely hidden from plaintiff's counsel. They couldn't figure this out, couldn't tie him back to him. But then they went to the building owner, the least culpable person in this scenario. All he did was own a building. He's leasing it to this nightclub. And when he tried to settle, they're like, man, nah, we did an asset search, and look, this is what they said. They said, we know what you're worth, and we know you can afford to pay. So we're going to take policy plus on you. And he's looking at the other guy, which happened to be his son. He's like, this is BS. You have more than me, and you're walking away without paying anything. And he said, well, Dad, that's why you don't hold things in your own name the way you do. And so that's the way I approach planning. You can't sue what you can't see. And if you set it up that way, it's a great defense.
Interesting. And as someone who has set things up in a certain way, how easy is it to change once it's already in place?
Yeah, so I mean, you can do some things, but unfortunately, there's always going to be a trail there. If somebody were to dig hard enough, they're going to be able to find it out. But I often tell people, I said, most attorneys in my experience that bring these types of cases are lazy, and they're just going to do a cursory analysis, and they're not going to dig deeper to see who's actually involved. So it's worth pursuing. But what's even more important too, when you're setting up these structures, is understanding the tax side of it. That, when you set up an LLC, we all know they're pass-through entities, and a lot of people like to set up disregarded LLCs so they don't have to pay a CPA to file a tax return. And I get it. I mean, most of my LLCs are disregarded. They don't file federal tax returns. But I like to filter that down onto my 1040 by having that. I call it a holding company. We'll set up an LLC in a state like Wyoming or Delaware, and it'll own all my single family residential LLCs will all point down to it. And on that one, I'm going to have it set up to be treated as a partnership. So it's going to file a 1065. And I know that some people say it's a cost. I'm going to tell you it's an investment. And when you pay a CPA to do that, because most of the loans that I've dealt with, or my clients are dealing with on the single family residential side, they're underwritten by Freddie Fannie guidelines because those brokers are selling them off. And so they're going to take your 1040 and they're going to look at your Schedule E and they say, all right, look at all these properties. You're a new investor. You have 3 properties, right? And they're on your Schedule E, page 1, because either you hold them in your own name or you hold them through a disregarded LLC where you got the asset protection. But when you're applying for that next loan and they run a debt to income ratio on you to see whether or not you qualify, you're pulling in $50,000 a year in rental income, but they're not going to give you credit for 50K. They're only going to give you credit for about 38,000. And you're going to say, well, that's not fair. And I say, yeah, but we have to take 25%, throw it out the window, because Freddie Fannie won't buy this stuff if we give you full credit. We only can give you credit for 75% for vacancies. But if you hold it the way I'm describing, you take that same amount of income, you put it on a different page of your tax return, the way it filters down, then you get 100% of that income credited towards your debt to income ratio. And it's just, I mean, I find it astonishing how many people continue to make these mistakes where they start getting up against this debt limit on investment property, loan limits, and they're wondering, well, why is that? And, I can pull out their 1040 or, our team's doing like, it's right here.
Right here.
You need to change this. And it's as simple as just changing what you're doing.
Very, very interesting. So at what point would you say it's appropriate for someone to sit down with someone such as yourself or at your firm or do some real business and tax and legal planning? Is it their first property, before they got their first property? Is it after they have 5? Is there a good number?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. So if you're just strictly single family, then the next question is going to be, if you haven't bought any properties yet, you're a single family investor, my next question is going to be, how are you going to fund it, the deal? If you're going to use traditional financing, then what I would tell you is, listen, get the property first. If you're going to buy a property, maybe you think that you're going to be able to do a cash out refi in a short period of time on it within 6 months, you're going to try to angle for that. Well, then I can't even touch that property. You can't do any planning with it for the first 6 months. But if it's not that type of play where you're buying the property, and rehabbing it and then going to do a cash out refi on it, then my recommendation would be, after you get your first property, that would be the time to explore what we're doing as far as asset protection is concerned. Now, if you're buying for cash or private money is coming into the deal to finance it for you, and so you're not dealing with a broker, or maybe it's a portfolio lender. I often tell individuals, I always tell people that I work with in our events, hey, go out and find a community lender, develop a relationship with a community bank. That's going to be one of your best friends going forwards. I mean, it has been for me, and those deals I can't put together through other means. And they have different lending standards. So in that situation, maybe you explore possibly taking title in the LLC itself so it never hits your name. Yeah, you're going to be on the debt, but those types of lenders they will allow you to close in an LLC, whereas your Freddie Fannie stuff, it can't happen. You're going to have to close in your own name, and then you can transfer later on into the limited liability company. So I'd like to close in the name. And the way I typically tell people to write up their agreements, if you're making an offer, put your name and or designated entity on the offer. And the reason I use that language is so that if it turns out that I'm working with a portfolio or private, I can then set up an LLC and close in that LLC. And the lender couldn't object to it, or the seller couldn't object, because I had that language in there. And if you're ever asked by the realtor or the seller, why did you put that extra line in there? Best response is and then fill in CPA or attorney, you choose, told me that they're not sure yet on how I'm going to need to take title to this property for either, choose again, tax or estate planning, throw it in there, purposes. And so they may want me to close in one of the entities they've set up for me. And then whenever you throw those names out there, CPA or attorney, tends to make the sellers and their agents go, oh, okay, no problem.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, all right.
That's great. That's great. It's something I actually do on every offer I make or every purchase I make is Michael Album or assignee, because I need to be able to move that around.
Perfect. Yeah, you're an avid investor, so you've been doing it.
Yeah. No, that's a great tip. That's a great tip. Clint, I'm curious to know, and hopefully you can shed some light on this. Something I've heard in the past is if I go get a really big umbrella policy, even inside of an LLC, or a big high liability limit on an insurance policy, I'm putting a big target on my back. Because like Absolutely. You mentioned, a lot of these folks are not going to go much deeper. And so they're going to say, look, here's the policy limit. This guy's worth $5 million or this gal's worth $5 million. So how do you think about how much to insure. Something I've heard is insure up to the property value or the equity rather in an LLC or in the property. I'm curious to get your thoughts around how much insurance should you get?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think is typically a good way to approach it. Whatever your foreseeable risk of loss could be on that property. So typically, you're going to be looking at somewhere around 200,000, 250 total for any type of bodily harm, injury, things like that that could come up from that. But that's not to say I wouldn't still have an umbrella policy if you can get it. I mean, I'm sure you've had some other events where you've interviewed people who work with real estate investors and they offer those types of policies. There's a number of them. There's a few of them out there that I direct people to as well, because it's good just to have the umbrella. Now, if you go excess liability, what a lot of people don't realize with insurance is that these things get stacked on top of one another. So if any layer there gets cut out many times, it throws off the rest. So you could say, well, I have this umbrella policy or excess liability policy, but if it's predicated on your umbrella paying first, well, then if they doesn't pay, then they don't pay. And so that's why I'm not into the stacking the insurance game, because many times they find ways to get out of it.
That makes sense. And I'm curious if you could share with us some common mistakes that you hear people that experience in their life, whether they're a new client and they're like, oh, Clint, I tried to do it the cheap route and do it on my own, and now I need you to fix it, or someone was working with somebody else, and regale us with some America's Funniest Home Videos.
Well, it typically comes down to this. It's not understanding the investment that they're getting into and what's going to happen down the road. For example, I was working with, this was last year, a guy called me, saw me on YouTube, calls me up and says, hey, I've been trying to sell this multifamily deal that I got into, I bought, and buyers keep falling out of under the financing contingency. I've gone through 2, I've got my 3rd one on right now, and what's going on? I said, well, how's it held? He said, an LLC. And I said, well, let me guess, your LLC is a disregarded LLC. He said, yeah, that's the way I set it up. And I said, on whose advice? Well, my CPA said I wouldn't have to file a tax return if I did it this way. Well, he's right, but the problem is that when you go to sell, the underwriter's going to look up and they're going to pull title. It's going to say LLC, and then what they're going to ask for is tax returns. I mean, they assume every LLC has to file a tax return. So that's your problem. You can't verify income and expenses. You should have been set up filing a return. And so it's things like that creep up on people. Or let's say you don't understand the state law with regards to holding property. I brought up Florida. Let's say you buy some property in Florida, you set up an LLC, you deed your property into the Florida LLC, you got $150,000 in debt on it. The assessor sends you a bill a month and a half later saying you owe $1,500 in doc stamps. You're like, well, where did this come from? Well, it's because you put it in the LLC. You should have never done that. So those are the things that come up. Or Pennsylvania, for instance, if you set up an LLC in Pennsylvania and you transfer your property in, the county's going to nick you for at least between $2,000 to $8,000, $10,000, $12,000 on that property transfer. So knowing what you should do to get that protection is so important. And that's where investors oftentimes make these mistakes, or they just don't do anything. And that's the worst. And I often tell people, when I teach, before COVID, we'd always teach these live events, 3-day asset protection events for real estate investors. And on break, you always got attendees that want to rush you and ask you questions. And I could always pick that one guy that had the story. And I knew the story before he even got up to the front of the room because of the look on their face. And I always start out like this. I used to have, and now I don't. And I wish
back in the good old days.
Yeah, and I wish and my wife told me, and I didn't listen, but I do now. So those are the things that you can't ever predict when a lawsuit's going to occur. And if you're going to start investing in real estate, just understand what you're getting into and look at setting up a structure as investing back into your business. And that's what you need to look at real estate investing as a business. And then not only do you need the right structure, you need the right tax and accounting firm to work with, or CPA who's going to keep good books and records for you, profit and loss, balance sheet, because there's going to come a time where someone's going to ask for that information. And if your stuff doesn't look professional, like you actually pay attention to the details, then whoever you're working with is going to make an assumption that you're too risky. to do business with, and it's going to create doubt in their mind. And those instances come about at times when you least expect it. I mean, look what's gone on now with COVID. You go back to last year where they had the EIDL loan and the triple P loans. A lot of people, we couldn't help get this money because they'd never paid attention to their financial side, the profit and
Oh,
loss of the balance sheet.
no.
Yeah, I mean, literally, guys would write down their P&L on a napkin. I've got pictures of
On a
this crap.
napkin.
Yeah, they would. Oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. They would take a picture of it and send it in and say, "Here, give this to the SBA." I'm like, "Are you serious? A napkin?" Yeah, buddy, it can't help you. And then they'd be mad.
At least use graph paper. Come on.
Yeah, something, and crayons. So. Yeah, it's interesting, but that's what I often tell people. There are certain things you need to do, and if you're sticking your head in the sand saying, "No, it's never going to happen to me," then it is going to happen to you. But it seems like if you appreciate the risk and you take reasonable steps to mitigate that risk, you're going to be in a much better situation, because no one wants to give it all away after you've spent 5, 10, 15 years building this stuff up.
Yep. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
Clint, I've got 2 more questions before you, and then I'm going to let you get out of here.
Okay.
One is, I've actually heard of using debt as a form of asset protection, in the sense that if I saddle this property with debt, I take out all of my equity possible, no one's going to want to sue me over it because they don't stand a whole lot to gain. Is that a fair way to think about it?
Well, see, all right. So I tell people the exact same thing. We show them strategies where they can put, I'll call it phantom debt on their own property to make it look unattractive to a creditor to want to go after them. We refer to these as friendly liens. But at the end of the day, they're just smoke screens, number one. And that's to discourage the shakedown lawsuits, right? Where somebody's coming after you, really don't have a claim. They think they're just going to put pressure on you and you're going to capitulate and roll over and pay them.
Right.
But on a legit judgment, no, that's not going to help you, because what an attorney would do in my instance, I would just record the judgment in the county wherever you're located, and that debt's just going to sit there. And if you try to sell or refi any property, I'm going to get paid. And so I'm going to sit back, I'm going to make 10% rate of annual interest on that debt. And what you're going to be doing is working for me, but you just don't realize it because you're not going to default on your debt. You're going to keep paying that mortgage down. And eventually one of these days, you're going to want to sell that property or refi that property. And that's the day I'm going to get paid. Or I'm going to move against the property at such time where I figure there's enough equity in there, because the equity is going to continue to go up. So it's a payday. I mean, a lot of times that's what plaintiffs will do. They're not going to move on the property directly. They're going to sit back and wait and let that judgment, grow at a 10 cap. Who doesn't want a 10 cap? So that's what it does for you.
Yeah. So not necessarily a cure-all of, hey, I'll just lay it in the thing with debt and I don't have to worry about it.
You do when you want to sell or refi, because that's when they get paid.
That's when they get paid. Okay. That's really good to know. That's really good to know. And then my last question for you is, because you mentioned California, and I'm a California guy, and I think we've got a lot of California listeners, the $800 a year California franchise tax fee just sucks. Like, there's no other way to put it. So how, you mentioned that there's a way to get around it, and was that via a trust?
Yeah, actually, there's a couple ways around it. One way is to use what's referred to as a disregarded limited partnership, and that is an entity similar to a limited liability company. But the issue I have with that strategy is that it's predicated upon a franchise tax board ruling in 2019 that held the disregarded LP did not fall under the revenue and tax code provision that assesses the $800 to disregarded LLCs. They said, hey, if the legislature intended to, they would have put disregarded LPs in there, but they didn't. They just said disregarded LLCs. Well, the franchise tax board moved to get the legislature to change the law, the revenue and tax code, which they have not done yet, to incorporate disregarded limited partnerships in that definition as being subject to the $800 franchise tax. You can use them, and I have some clients that prefer to go that route because they're more familiar with the limited partnership and working with third parties, but there's always a risk California changes it and incorporates it into the revenue and tax code because of this tax court ruling. Now, on the other side of that is to use business trusts. And you've probably heard the term Delaware Statutory Trust, which is a trust that has become synonymous with 1031 exchanges. So if you sold a piece of property and then you wanted to roll into a syndication, it wouldn't qualify into a typical syndication structured as an LLC. But if you structure it as a trust, the IRS has ruled that it's an acceptable interest to roll into. And so a lot of syndicators that want to bring in 1031 money started using that Delaware statutory trust framework to allow this to occur. Well, the trust itself offers asset protection. So if you put an asset into it and something goes wrong with that asset, the beneficiaries of the trust are completely protected from the claims of the trust creditors. Wyoming has a statute that's very similar to Delaware. And I choose to use Wyoming just because it's a little less expensive and it's got a little more flexibility built into their trust statute. So what we'll do for our California investors oftentimes is create a Wyoming statutory trust, then register it in California as a business trust. We have to make one filing in California, and then they can start holding their California real estate in these business trusts instead of limited liability companies. And the business trust is not subject to that $800 franchise fee. And in fact, if you invest outside of California, I mean, the Franchise Tax Board has taken the position that since you live in California, any LLC you create on this planet or some other planet is doing business in California. And they want $800 out of it. Yeah. So many times we'll just set up the trust in every state that we can that actually recognizes a business trust to hold real estate.
Very interesting.
That's the way around it.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah. I'll still have an LLC though for you. We'll still have your interest in that trust owned by typically a Wyoming limited liability company, and you'll still have to pay $800 on that. So you can't get away from the $800 fee completely with the way we put the structures together. We'll just minimize it down to no more than $1,600 a year total. So you could have 50 trusts and you're not paying more than $1,600. And banks, I mean, I just did a deal with one of my clients. We set up 4 WSTs for some buildings in California, and they were able to go through the refi process with Chase Bank. I had to do some work with Chase to get them to understand it. Namely, they said these don't exist. And I said, well, hell, you guys underwrote this loan right here, and it's in a Delaware statutory trust. So what am I missing here? You guys are obviously using these things. And yeah, it went through.
It went through.
There is a little bit of a learning curve there for some institutions, but they do work.
Okay. All right. Well, I might have to schedule a call with you here offline because there's definitely something there. Well, Clint, this has been so great, man. Thank you so much for taking the time. Where can folks get a hold of you or send any of your colleagues if they have additional questions, want to reach out to you for your services?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give anybody that would like a free strategy session. If you just go in the show notes, it's aba.link/Roofstock. You can go there and click on that link. It'll bring you to a website and just put in the information. Or if you just want to, Google my name, YouTube, I got a ton of information. I mean, we lead by educating people, and we give it all away for free, the education, because we want you to make informed decisions when it comes to your investing. And it's really based upon, as I stated, real world experience, because we're doing what you're doing when it comes to investing. And I'm sharing with you those strategies that I'm finding that are helpful for me and those for our clients to help them find success and build their business.
Love it. Love it. Well, Clint, thanks again. Definitely look forward to chatting with you, and do yourself a favor. Take care. All right.
Thank you. Likewise.
Alrighty, everybody. A big, big, big thank you to Clint. That was an awesome episode. I know that I got a lot out of it. And as he was talking, I was like, oh, I probably need to be doing some changing around here. So definitely give that one another listen to. Definitely check out the show notes with a link to a free consult with Clint and his team. I think it's definitely something that everybody can learn and use from. If you like the episode, as always, feel free to leave us a rating or review. We love to hear about new episode ideas. So leave us a comment in the comment section, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.